Hey everyone, had an unusual experience that I'd like to share with you. Actually freaked my girlfriend out a little bit, so I figured I'd bring it to a bigger audience. I've been doing a bit of somatic work, which is mostly akin to guided meditations. I put on my headphones and I listen to instructions on how to properly connect to my body. The intention is nervous system healing. So we have our conscious mind, our subconscious mind, and then what's sometimes referred to as the primal mind, which deals with a lot of, in this case, traumas and or chronic stress that may actually be stored in the body. So people that have long-term health challenges and or have personality traits, fear-based personality traits that they can't quite get over, often come to find that it's traumas that they may not even been aware of, like in my case, car accident, carnival ride that malfunctioned, things like that that were actively being stored within the soma, within the body, that I hadn't had any conscious awareness of 20, 25 years later. So I ended up getting into this program where on a regular basis, a few times a week, I would sit and listen to my headphones. You kind of drop into it. It can be very focused. You're listening to a very calm, consistent voice. And it didn't take more, I guess it was probably about 40 minutes or so, more, 40, 50 minutes that I was along. So I was quite involved in this session. So just for some background, I'm sitting there on my bed. My eyes are closed. I have blackout shades, so the room is incredibly dark to begin with, and the whole intention is to go ahead and drop down any type of distractions. So with the exception of the audio recording, nothing else is being stimulated for me. And as I'm sitting there, I had an image, a face. So almost as if it's where my hand is, maybe no more than a foot or a foot and a half in front of me. There was the face of a young black girl, very, very fair-skinned, like a vibrant, beautiful girl, couldn't have been more than maybe 15 or 16 years old. And her head down to her neck just floated right in front of me. And, just to keep in mind for context, because I'm not deeply in my conscious mind, because I'm quite connected with the somatic work, for the first few seconds that she was floating in front of me, I didn't really even tune into it. Anytime I'd ever done these exercises, it was always just darkness that I saw. And now, even with my eyes closed, I saw a great deal of light, and I saw this, she had pigtails, and maybe even like she had some pigments in her skin. But she was like right in front of me, this young girl. And it didn't take more than a few seconds for when my mind engaged and realized that I was looking at somebody, and no sooner did I see her, that she realized I could see her, and she very intently stared back at me. And it was almost as if we were amazed or surprised that we were now seeing each other. And no sooner did that enter into my consciousness, that I'm looking at a floating head staring right at me, that she started to dissolve from left to right. It was almost pixelated. It was almost like she wasn't there. She was just slowly disappearing in front of me, and there was nothing I could do, or she could do for that matter, to stop it. I collected myself, couldn't quite understand what had just happened, and I laid down on the bed and instinctively curled up into the fetal position, and these waves of sadness started to wash over me, and I just started crying. And I'm not a crier by my nature, and the sadness that I was experiencing was completely foreign. I had no frame of reference for the sadness. It really wasn't. Those weren't my tears that I was experiencing, and I didn't know what to make of them, and so I just let them come out. And maybe 5 minutes later or so, I was pretty much back to normal. a little bit disoriented from what I had experienced without any explanation of what was going on. I got out of bed and I just continued with my day. And I sat with that sensation for most of the day trying to figure it out. I had talked to a couple people, some of the wonderful people in the community here on the forum. I had shared it with them. I have read for some really amazing spiritual people who are deeply on their path recently, and I had talked to them about it, and they had given me their feedback. But I was really struggling to understand more completely exactly what was going on. And so I started to dig, as I do. It's kind of my nature. I have a curious mind and some academic tendencies, and it's almost as if I can't get enough information when I, it's like a dog with a bone. When I hold on to something, just refuse to let it go. And so I ended up coming across a lecture by Bott, actually. He's a spiritualist. He's been around for a number of years. He has some decent content online. I can include some links here. And he did a brilliant job explaining a similar experience, not quite where he was seeing somebody, but he describes being in the midst of an incredibly powerful, insightful dream. And somewhere in the midst of the dream, he's not obviously aware that he's dreaming, he's just dreaming. He had to pee. And so as he wakes up to get out of bed, the very first thought that enters into his consciousness was, wow, that's such a powerful experience. I have to write it down. I have to remember it. It's going to stay with me forever. By the time he got to the bathroom, no more than a few steps away, he had no recollection of it whatsoever. And he's frustrated as he's in the bathroom that he can't remember anything that was just so profound only a few seconds earlier. He ends up coming back to bed, ends up dozing back off, and sure enough, returning to that dreamlike state and once again having a renewal, a continuation of the dreams that he was having earlier. And so the way he describes it, he says very clearly that the veil between the conscious and the soul, or the subconscious mind, is incredibly opaque and yet all the while incredibly thin. And so every so often, when you're in a dreamlike state, for example, you've disengaged the conscious mind. The subconscious, or the soul's intention, the soul's mind, can now become more prominent. And as a result, it has the ability to bring in potentially past life experiences. It oftentimes brings in incarnations in foreign realms. Like I often have, for most of my life, I've had this dream where I'm standing completely still, and I just go and I jump straight up, and I go so high. It's like this most euphoric feeling, and then I gradually descend back down onto the earth, wherever I happen to be, and then I go and I do it again, almost as if I could hurt myself because I'm going so high and I'm fearful of what could happen when I come back down, but I come down very slowly, and I realize that I'm in an alternate realm where the gravitational force is completely different. And so those kind of experiences, which have recycled through my subconscious, which have come out in dreams in various fashions on some remarkable repeat loop, are simply my subconscious, or my soul's energy in this context, bringing some of its experiences more into my space of awareness. And that explanation, as John gave it, made absolute perfect sense, because we move between our conscious and subconscious mind, and yet all the while, when one is engaged, it feels almost impossible to access the other. It may be a thin veil, but it's so incredibly opaque. And so then I went a little bit further, and I have friends that have gone very deep with plant-based medicines. I know ayahuasca is incredibly popular. A friend of mine had sent me some research just recently, which actually showed that they had hooked up electrodes to the mind, the brains of people who are actively engaged in ayahuasca, and they were experiencing this amazing insight into their subconscious and greater clarity on their intention here. And some people were able to release all sorts of really difficult, deep emotional traumas or dark experiences that they had had by virtue of going on to this plant-based medicine. And what those electrodes connected to the skull, to the brain, were showing was that while you're actively, the active ingredient dimethyltryptamine, the DMT, while that was in the brain, the alpha waves, which is the waves that are represented when you're in a conscious state, those diminish, and the theta waves, which are indicative of sleep, those come to life. So it's effectively, even though you're hanging out oftentimes in group settings, oftentimes with music and different types of physical or social interaction at hand. What is indicative of an ayahuasca journey is akin to being in a sleep-like state where you can actively drop in and access the subconscious, or as I continue to put it, the soul and the soul's intention or thoughts. To go one step further, certainly those that go very deep into meditation, those that go deep into regression work, those that have been successful with hypnotherapy. Certainly the best example could be an NDE, a near-death experience, where you actively have died on, say, an operating table, and you watch yourself float up from your body, and you can still hear the conversations around you, but all the while you're being pulled into the spirit realm, and then the body is resuscitated, or oftentimes the spirit is being told that it's not their time and that they should go back into the body, and they return, and then boom, they still have memory of what just happened because their physical being was dead and the conscious mind was turned off. And so it was just soul energy, but now the soul has gone back into the physical form, and the physical form, the conscious mind, is now re-engaged, and it's as if nothing ever happened. They may have the memory of it, but otherwise are just continuing their life. And there are literally, it's amazing when you look at the statistics, there are literally millions of people that have near-death experiences that, regardless of their background, regardless of their culture, regardless of their age, they almost always have very similar type of experiences, which are really quite profound. And so what it's all getting at is that whatever experience I had in that somatic work, and I've done so much transcendental meditation and guided meditations, and I've done a series of different types of techniques to try to quiet the conscious mind. Whatever happened to me when I dropped into that somatic space was enough to properly disengage my conscious mind and to actively allow me, this is once again just my opinion, but to actively allow me to see spirit energy of another. So in this case, that young girl who happened to be present, it wasn't in my consciousness, it wasn't my soul. It was the soul of another entity that happened to be passing by, and for a brief moment, maybe no more than a few seconds, I could see her, and when she realized that I could see her, she looked at me in return, and we were locked in. And as soon as I started to question what was going on, I came out of that theta wave, out of that deeply soulful space, and I returned into my conscious mind, and no sooner did I do that she disappeared from my space. I don't really understand why I had that wave of sadness. As I said, it wasn't my sadness. I don't know why I started crying. I can't quite explain all of it, but I felt, however briefly, as if I had managed to connect into a different dimension, into an altered realm, if you will. The last thought, the last point that I'll leave you with, which I thought was just fascinating, because I'm a big fan of Edgar Cayce, and I'm reading his biography, and some of his work is just fascinating. And I just want to read a piece, because he's young. He happens to be, if you're not familiar with Edgar Cayce, he was born in I think it's the 1880s, and this book is from the 1940s. So it dates back, his life is about over 100 years old, over 100 years ago, when he was doing his most impactful work, which was mostly around medical intuitive work, where he could actively tap into either the patient's higher consciousness or into the Akashic records and obtain the information that he needed to heal the patient of any ailment, and with amazing amounts of specificity, with incredible amounts of clarity. So here he is as a child, and there's a passage from the book which I thought was relevant because it describes how, in his case, his third eye or his sixth sense was so incredibly enhanced, and that he had this natural gift that he was actively interacting with the spirit realm from a very early age. And the book, it's taking place in rural Kentucky, and the passage says, "There are plenty of fish too, both in the brooks and in the ponds. In summer, fishing was his greatest joy, and then the days were long and hot, and the men worked in the fields. The women stayed indoors, canning fruit and vegetables, and he had no playmates but his sisters. There was one new being born all the time, it seemed, until there were 4 of them: Annie, Mary, Ola, and Sarah. From them and their dolls, he was glad to get away for long hours beside the water, dreaming as he waited for a fish to come by and take up the worm he had offered. His little play folk came to him there to be with him. They were always his size. As he grew older, they grew older too, and what he wanted to do was always seemingly what they wanted to do. Sometimes there were only a few of them, sometimes there were many. One day there would be all boys, another day it would be all girls. They went away when another person came, unless it was little Anna Say. She was the neighbor's daughter and just his age. The playfolk seemed to really like her, and she could see them and even talk with them. She was inquisitive, and one day, when it rained, they all ran to the playhouse that they had built on the top of one of the barns. She asked the playfolk why they didn't get wet. And one of them said, "Oh, we can't get wet. We live with the flowers and the music." "What music?" Anna asked. "The music of everything," the little fellow said. Once he and Anna waded out to an island in the creek in the back of the farmer's farm, and there at the water's edge they found other little folk. But these would have nothing to do with them. They said that they had never been girls or boys and would rather play with the dragonflies. He wondered if the playfolk would ever come back, and after the cold winter during which Anna and her father both died of pneumonia, he thought that either they would go away with her or that perhaps she would come back and be playing with all of them. When spring came, he went to the woods, and there they were, but little Anna was not with them. He played with them, and he suddenly realized that that summer they had stopped growing, and they were no longer keeping pace with him. He knew that that's when he was going to lose them. And so my mind tries to make sense of that passage, and I think about moving between the physical realm and the spirit realm, first connecting with your own soul, but then if you're successful in doing so, possibly even dropping in enough that you can start to feel or to see the spiritual energy around you. And I know certainly that clairvoyance and mediums have the capacity oftentimes to do that. But by my own experience, I can't help but wonder that perhaps we all have that capacity, and that it merely takes some intention on our part to start disengaging or quieting the monkey mind, the chitter chatter in the conscious mind, and properly dropping in a little bit more so that we can become more aware of all this amazing energy which is going on all around us all the time. And if nothing more, become more adept at listening to what I call our soul or our higher consciousness, which oftentimes has so many of the answers that we seek, but because we're not listening properly or haven't developed the skills to properly listen, we can't possibly hear it. So that's all I had for you guys today. It was just something that I very much wanted to share. I hope you enjoyed. This is one of those that I always encourage comments anyways, but this is one that if you have any insight or can explain a little bit of what I experienced, I very much encourage you to engage a little bit. And then as always, feel free to share it with anybody else that you think might have some comments or some insight. All right, everyone, lots of love, lots of light, and we'll speak with you all real soon.